Hi, it's Klayton, aka Celldweller, Scandroid, Circle of Dust, FreakGen, and lastly, but quite possibly most importantly, Dad. Welcome to the Squeaky Chair Sessions, an interview hosted by the Vice President of FiXT, James Rhodes, sometime in 2015, 2016, or I don't know. Please enjoy.
So talk about the evolution of going from just being a musician in that you were playing music, making music on gear, but you were going into, you didn't control the mixes on the first several albums.
No, I had no idea how to. In fact, I wasn't even given the option. And in hindsight, I listened to the 4-track demos I sent into the label, and they sounded better than the final product, which is really sad. Me with zero experience miking guitars, I had no idea. But basically they were like, write the album and then you're going to drive out, which I did, in a car, with my gear in a car.
From New York
to Chicago.
Oh, Chicago.
First album I did in Chicago. And they stuck me with an engineer who didn't really know what he was doing, in a room he didn't really know, and with gear that was primarily broken. So I don't know what they paid. Hopefully they got a great deal on the studio space. All I know is they charged it back to my recording account, I'm sure. But yeah, the album, I had 10 days to track every instrument, including all the vocals, to an entire album, which I had never done before, and mix and walk out of the studio with final masters in 10 days. And then literally I am alone. I'm by myself. I drove 17 hours straight. I didn't sleep. I went 17 hours straight from New York to Chicago, and I was sleeping on somebody's couch there. I don't even remember the arrangement. It was somebody that worked at the label, lived there, and I was sleeping on his couch for the 10 days I was there. Yeah, I basically starved. I had no money for food, so whatever per diem I had, I ate probably whatever they provided at the studio, and spent every hour that I was allowed to be in there getting the album done. And the album ended up sounding absolutely fucking awful. Like I was so embarrassed when I was done. The guitars didn't sound like guitars. My vocals, my voice had blown out about halfway through tracking the album, and I still had half the album to track. So I was tracking the album with basically laryngitis. I had no voice. So some of the melodies I had even worked out, I couldn't even sing because I physically couldn't do them. So it was a learning experience for me, for sure. But yeah, like the first 2 or 3 albums I did, there was no option for me to
mix.
I didn't even have the gear, so I couldn't even record and mix on my own anyway, unless I wanted to do it on a 4-track. I couldn't afford it. And somewhere along the way, I met this guy, Vin Sirik, who had access to an ADAT machine. He may have even owned the ADAT machine, and he was the only guy I had met to that point who I was friends with who actually had any clue what was going on with recording. So I glommed every shred of information he would give me, and I learned. And so the Metamorphosis album, which was the 3rd album I technically did, which is a miracle unto itself how I even did that album, because I did that all of these remixes on a sampler that had 2 megabytes of memory, mono sampling memory, that I saved to floppy disks, and I had to empty the machine 3 times to get one song done. So I loaded the machine 4 times to get one song. So I had to basically stripe SMPTE to 1 track on my 4-track, which is a way you could lock my computer. So I would stripe down everything I had programmed in mono to 1 track, and then do a second round on the sampler of a next level of programming, and then stripe that down to a mono track, and then the 3rd track, and then the 4th track would be virtual. So because the 4th track on the 4-track itself had the SMPTE that I needed on there, so I could only put 3 out on a time on the 4-track, and the 4th one would be virtual. And I went to final mix. We had like 3 or 4 days to do the final mix, and I heard those mixes in their full stereo glory for the first time ever in that 3 or 4 days we were mixing, because that was the first time I was able to stripe all of my passes of my ADAT down to a left and a right on channels 1 and 2 on an ADAT, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and 7 and 8. So I got 4 stereo tracks of all the stuff I had programmed, which was...
How did you know if it was going to work or not?
I had no idea it was going to work.
Did you make changes in the mixing session?
There wasn't even a mixing board, so virtually none. If in the spot something was too loud, I probably went in and changed a little bit of MIDI and punched it in, but we had there was no time. Vin took off work, and I told the label, I'm like, I need $500 because this kid's taking off work to mix, or I can't mix this album. So they gave me $500 for the
which
whole,
you handed to him.
Which I handed to him. So I got $500 to do a 74-minute remix album that I didn't keep a single dime of that money. For me, it was more, I just wanted to make the album. This was like my chance to make music, you know? So it didn't even come to me. I wasn't even in terms of like, oh my God, I'm getting ripped off. I didn't even think about it in those terms. I was just able to. So it was the first time I actually had somewhat of control over my own mix. And then Argyle Park being the next thing, that I had now bought my own ADATs, multiple ADATs, but didn't really know how to use them. So Vin Sirik took work off again for like a week or 10 days to mix the Argyle album. And at that point I had gotten like a Korg 1 effects unit. I had a Boss SC70, which I still have, a Roland, or is it a Boss? I think it's a Boss. It had a vocoder that I did Chasm with later on in life. That was the vocoder I used. But I had a little bit of gear and some ADATs, but I still didn't have all the know-how. And Vin took off work, and we retracked. That's the first thing we did was the Circle 95 do-over. So I redid my first Circle album. That was a complete abortion, that first album I was talking about. Sonically, complete abortion. I finally had the chance. The label's like, yeah, we're going to re-release this album through different distros. So if you want to redo it, now or never. So on my own dime, on my own time, I redid that whole album and put a couple of new tracks on and dropped some ones that I didn't like. So he helped me with that one, as well as Argyle Park with like mix. And by that point, that was enough for me to go, whatever the next thing I do, which I ended up being Disengage, I did from top to bottom myself. And I really didn't know what I was doing, but I was learning as I was going along.
So what else changed between Argyle then and Disengage, as far as, did you get more gear? Was it a lot of trial and error, figuring out how to use the board and mix? And
oh yeah, Disengage actually happened halfway through my working with Chris Angel. So after my label went bankrupt, back in the day,
the label you were signed to.
The label I was signed to. The last project I actually did was Argyle Park. They went bankrupt, and they're like, well, we can't put out a new record because we're going bankrupt, but you're signed to us, so you can't go anywhere else. And at the same time, this guy, Chris Angel, I worked with his cousin. His cousin had given him a couple of my albums, and he was hitting me up going, hey, I want you to produce some music for me. I'm doing this 80s metal stuff, and I need to update my sound, and you're on the extreme edge of things, but you at least are more modern than what I'm doing. So I basically wasn't interested at all until now. I had no other option. I was like, oh, I should probably, I wasn't interested in working for anybody else. I just wanted to do my own thing. But here, as fate would have it, I was put in a position where I was like, okay, let me do this, and it ended up being a long-lasting relationship where we are still very close friends to this day. But so I started working on his stuff with him, writing songs and recording. Like, I was doing everything. And so that was a lot of where I started learning how to use my gear. I had now built myself up to 3 ADATs, so I had 24 tracks of digital audio through my, at that time still I had the 24 track mixer, so I was using all my channels on my Mackie mixer for ADAT channels. I didn't even know what a compressor was. I owned one Alesis 3630 compressor, and I didn't even know what to do with it. No one taught me how to use a compressor, so I didn't even compress vocals because I didn't even know what to do with them. And so I actually got a lot of experience learning through his mixes. And then Disengage, another label picked that album, came to me and said, hey, do you want to do one more Circle album? Essentially, I needed to do that album to pay the debt off for the attorney I was forced to hire to get out of my bad record deal that I was still tied in. So that took 1.5 years, and ultimately thousands and thousands of dollars that I didn't have. So I had to do an actual record with somebody else to get money to be able to pay off this attorney. And that was a nightmare. You know, we're not talking about my journey, but so that went south in a really bad way as well. But I ended up being able to do that and actually release that album, and worked with Chris for a couple more years before we parted ways, and he did his own thing, and then I started Celldweller. At that point, I had now branched into digital audio. What
was the impetus of going digital? Like, what was there a piece of gear that was like, oh, now I'm digital? What happened?
It was always outside of my reach. And to be clear, ADATs were digital audio. Technically, an ADAT was a digital machine,
right.
But when I say digital, I mean non-linear tape. I'm talking in the box, computer based. I had known of Pro Tools for years. I've seen rigs. I knew what it could do, even though when I saw those early rigs, you maxed out at 4 tracks of audio, but still, I was blown away. You could record stuff and move it around and copy it and paste it. I couldn't believe it. So the way I had done that before that is if I wanted to copy a performance, I literally had to go record it into a sampler one part at a time, program that in my sequencer to trigger these long samples, and then arrange my song, and then eventually play those samples back down to ADAT in the place that they're supposed to go. It was so painstaking. It was so time consuming. You were degrading your sound. I just didn't have any other choice. So I finally, after wanting a rig, a Pro Tools rig specifically for so many years, and it really being out of anyone's reach at that point, only the people who were really making money, as they for years have always historically been, they always had their nose turned up at the rest of the world thinking they were superior. I ended up bartering 2 tracks to work on somebody else's album. I bartered 2 songs in exchange for the most basic Pro Tools system you could get. I was like, I don't want cash. You buy me this Pro Tools rig right here, and I'll do these 2 songs for that. And that's how I got my first Pro Tools rig. And then the world of digital audio plugins, it revolutionized my entire life. I had no idea what I was doing. My signal to noise was horrible. I was recording, mic level in and without an amplifier. So I was boosting the signal in the box by 20 dB and adding all this noise. I didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea. But I learned through the process.
So I want to continue and get into what you learned and what the process of working on the Celldweller debut was, and what you learned maybe being there alongside Grant and Ben Gross and some of the mixers that you worked with. But speaking of not knowing what you were doing compared to now as far as production, how important do you think it is for somebody starting out that it's songwriting versus production quality?
Well, in my mind, production quality probably trumped songwriting at that time, because that was the thing that mostly escaped me. That was the thing that I could not figure out was production. I didn't think I wrote good songs at all anyway, so it didn't matter to me, because I just figured most of what I was writing was dog shit. Later in life, as it comes back around, and I realize how many people have not only listened to those songs, but these songs have affected their lives or changed the way that they've lived, or years later they've reconnected to the songs as I started re-releasing all my old Circle albums, talking about how these songs have made a difference in their lives. It makes me realize that was the most important part, because all of my embarrassment and the fact that I felt like a failure because those early albums sounded so bad to me and I couldn't do anything to fix that. To everyone I talked to that loved those albums, they didn't care. To them, it was great. They loved the way it sounded. I couldn't understand it. I was like, your ears are broken because these sound terrible. So the idea that the song is the most important thing, it took a long time for that to kind of reconcile in my own brain, because A, I didn't think I was writing good songs, and B, the production was the hardest thing for me the hardest nut for me to crack. Fortunately, I come from a really musical background in the sense that I soaked in a lot of music as a kid. And so through osmosis, without me even realizing it, I was learning how to write songs, because when I started writing my own songs, I would do something and go, that's not supposed to happen here. I'm supposed to do something else, and I don't know what it is. And I would keep searching until I'm like, this is the piece of the puzzle I was looking for. I didn't go to how to write a song class 101. Nobody taught me that. I did all that on my own, making my own mistakes. Just basically using intuition and going, that doesn't sound right. So I need to keep working on it until it does.
Interesting that you said earlier your arrangement style was maybe early influenced by the technology limitation that you had.
Mm-hmm. It was.
And that made you more progressive.
Yep.
Which
you know
those are very progressive.
Not just Celldweller, Circle.
But yeah.
Circle, it would just
it's even
so many songs. The tempo would change, the meter would change, things would just completely be like things you'd never hear twice in a song.
Right. But yeah, I feel like that's still stuck with you even over the years. That's like...
Yeah. And I'm actually glad that it has, because I feel like that is what helps shape. If I have a signature sound, that also helps define it. Because if I was just writing pop songs and I had my production style, there's other guys that probably could pull that off. But writing 7 or 8 minute epics that are good songs that take you on musical journeys, that's the kind of music that I loved. Like my grandfather would listen to these long synthesizer albums that had, the Tangerine Dreams of the world, that would have 18-minute songs, and it was progressive, and I would just get lost in these sounds and the music. I didn't care about a pop song. I couldn't care less. I was lost. I was taking a musical journey, and I loved it.
Where do you think your sense of melody and the types of melodies and harmonies that you used, do you feel like you can attribute any of that particular element back to anything?
I don't know, because an example of when I realized that it was somewhere in me without me knowing how it got there was actually when I had switched my major in college from pre-med to music, and I pretty much systematically did less and less in my music classes because I grew less and less interested in playing other people's music and learning theory. So what would pretty much happen by the end of the semester, right before I pretty much dropped out of college completely after I had gotten my record deal, I'd get homework assignments and I would blow them off until the last second. So literally I remember one specific day I was going to a music theory class, and the homework assignment was you needed to write a jingle for a commercial. And it could be about any product you want. And literally, I got out of my car in the parking lot, and I had about a 7-minute walk to class. And so I worked out what this product was going to be. I don't remember. It might have been a breakfast cereal. I don't know. And I came up with this melody progression in my head. And what I didn't realize that I had done was I had it musically resolved. And I didn't even know what that meant at the time. But it went off, did its thing, and by the end of the track, it resolved at the end, so you felt like, the song is over. So the teacher called on a bunch of people, they did their thing, and he would say what he'd say. He called me up, I spit my thing out that I had created 7 minutes earlier, and he's like, see, that's what I'm talking about. He understands how to write a song. He's explaining it in a way that I use theory to write this. He's dissecting it like I use theory. And I didn't use theory. I used intuition. I used that same process of going, well, it shouldn't go like this. It needs something else. So what do? I went up, I did this thing, and then I come down at the end and it musically resolves. And he pointed that out and it stuck with me, like me thinking about how did I don't totally understand. And I think it comes back to, like I said earlier, I listened to a lot of music. So through osmosis, I learned, because by the stuff I was listening to, I learned what music sounded like when it resolved, or when I listened to a chorus, or even though I didn't listen to just commercial music, there was that feeling you get when something resolves, and then I figured out a way to, in my own music or in my own creative process, identify when I created something that gave me that same feeling. I'm like, oh, that must be what I need to do, because that feels right. Not knowing that what I was doing was actually resolving the musical progression.